It was a cold evening, and the city lights flickered as people hurried back to their homes. In the corner of a small apartment, a tired father sat on the edge of his bed, looking at his little boy who lay asleep under a thin blanket. The father's name was Daniel. Life had never been easy for him, but ever since his wife passed away 2 years ago, the weight on his shoulders had grown heavier. He worked 2 jobs, one at a warehouse during the day and another at a gas station late at night. He barely had time to rest, but he never let his son feel unloved. The boy, named Oliver, was only 6 years old. He was small, gentle, and full of questions about the world. Daniel often wished he could give him better clothes, better food, a home with warmth and comfort. But all he could manage was enough to keep the rent paid and put simple meals on the table. Some nights, Daniel would skip dinner just so Oliver could have an extra portion. On this particular day, things had gone from difficult to frightening. Oliver had been coughing since the morning. At first, Daniel thought it was just a common cold. But by evening, his son's forehead felt hot, and his breathing grew uneven. Panic rose inside him. He had no car, and the nearest hospital was miles away. Still, he couldn't waste a moment. Daniel wrapped Oliver in his small jacket, held him close, and rushed out into the night. The streets were busy, but Daniel's heart raced faster than the cars that passed him. He waved down a taxi, though he knew it would cost him more than he could afford. As he placed Oliver gently inside, he whispered a quiet prayer, asking for strength. The ride to the hospital felt endless. Oliver leaned against him, mumbling softly, and Daniel held him tighter, fear filling every thought. When they arrived at the hospital, Daniel paid the driver with trembling hands, almost emptying his wallet. He pushed through the large glass doors and hurried inside. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the sound of footsteps and beeping machines echoed through the halls. Daniel approached the front desk, his voice unsteady as he explained that his son needed help. The receptionist gave him a sympathetic look and handed him a clipboard filled with forms. Daniel's chest tightened. He hated paperwork. It always came with questions about insurance, finances, and bills. Questions he never had good answers for. But he didn't argue. He took the forms, quickly scribbled down his information, and returned them. His only concern was Oliver. They were asked to wait. Daniel sat on a stiff chair, his boy resting on his lap. The waiting room was filled with people, some scrolling on their phones, others whispering quietly to each other. For Daniel, time felt frozen. He kept brushing his son's hair back, checking his temperature, wishing he could do more. He tried to stay calm, but the truth was, he felt helpless. As minutes stretched into nearly an hour, Daniel's worry grew. He thought about his late wife, about the promises he had made to her before she passed. "I'll take care of him," he had said with tears in his eyes. And he meant it. But tonight, sitting in that waiting room, he feared he might fail. Then, something unexpected happened. Oliver stirred in his arms and opened his eyes slightly. His little hand lifted, pointing across the room. "Daddy," he whispered weakly, "that's Mommy." Daniel froze. He looked where his son was pointing. A tall woman had just stepped out of one of the hospital offices. She was dressed in a sleek business suit, her heels clicking against the floor. She carried herself with confidence, the kind that only came with authority. People around her moved aside as if she were someone important. Daniel's face flushed. He quickly hushed Oliver, leaning down to whisper, "No, son, that's not Mommy." He felt embarrassed, even a little guilty. His boy didn't understand. He missed his mother so much that sometimes he mistook strangers for her. Daniel glanced back at the woman again. She was striking, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Clearly, she was no ordinary visitor, perhaps a doctor, or someone in charge. The woman paused for a moment, sensing the small voice that had spoken. Her eyes met Daniel's for a brief second. For reasons he couldn't explain, Daniel felt exposed, like she could see the pain behind his tired eyes. She didn't speak, though. Instead, she turned and continued down the hallway, disappearing into another room. Daniel let out a slow breath. He rubbed his son's back and whispered gently, "It's all right, Ollie. We'll see the doctor soon." But his heart ached. He knew his boy longed for a mother's warmth, something he could never replace. And no matter how strong he tried to be, moments like this reminded him of how incomplete their little family truly was. Another hour passed before a nurse finally called their name. Daniel stood, carrying Oliver in his arms. His legs felt heavy from waiting, his mind clouded with worry, but he followed the nurse inside. The bright hospital lights seemed almost blinding after the dim waiting room. They were led to a small examination room, where Oliver was carefully placed on a bed. As the nurse checked his vitals, Daniel kept his hand on his son's shoulder, whispering words of comfort. The nurse assured him a doctor would arrive shortly, but Daniel's chest still felt tight. He couldn't stop replaying Oliver's words in his mind, "That's Mommy." It was such an innocent mistake, but something about the woman's brief glance lingered in his thoughts. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this night would change more than just his son's health. It would change everything about their lives. For now, though, all he could do was wait and hope that the doctors would bring good news. He kissed his son's forehead, whispering once again, "I'm here, buddy. Daddy's right here. We'll be okay." The little boy closed his eyes and gave a faint smile. In that moment, despite the uncertainty, Daniel knew one thing with certainty: he would never stop fighting for his son, no matter how hard life became. Daniel sat in the small hospital room, his hands clasped tightly together as he waited for the doctor to arrive. The sound of machines, beeping faintly in the background, filled the silence. Oliver lay on the bed, looking pale, his little chest rising and falling unevenly. Daniel wished he could trade places with his son. He would rather carry all the pain himself than see his boy suffer even for a second. Moments later, the door opened and a young doctor walked in, carrying a clipboard. She gave Daniel a polite smile before checking on Oliver. She listened carefully to the boy's breathing, looked into his throat, and gently pressed his stomach. Daniel watched her every move, waiting for answers. His mind was filled with fears. What if this was something serious, something he couldn't afford to treat? The doctor finally straightened up and spoke. "It looks like your son has a bad infection. We'll need to run a few tests to be sure, but don't worry, he's in good hands." Her words gave Daniel a little comfort, but only for a moment. He knew tests meant bills, and bills meant trouble. Still, he nodded and thanked her, pretending to be calm for Oliver's sake. Inside, though, he was terrified. The nurse came back and prepared to take Oliver for the tests. As she wheeled the bed out, Oliver held tightly onto Daniel's hand. "Daddy, don't go," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," Daniel assured him, bending down to kiss his forehead. "I'll be right here when you come back." When the bed rolled out of the room, Daniel sat alone. He buried his face in his hands, his thoughts racing. He thought about the rent that was due in a week, about the groceries they still needed, about the fact that he hadn't even bought Oliver new shoes in months. And now, this. Life had a way of testing him over and over again, and he wondered how much more he could take. As he sat there lost in thought, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't a nurse or a doctor. It was her, the same woman Oliver had pointed at earlier in the waiting room. The same woman he had called Mommy. She stepped into the room with quiet confidence. Up close, Daniel could see she wasn't just well-dressed, she carried herself like someone important. There was a certain authority in her posture, the kind that made people listen when she spoke. "Mr. Daniel?" she asked, her voice calm yet direct. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Yes." She extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Hayes. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of this hospital." For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. CEOs didn't walk into small patient rooms, and they certainly didn't introduce themselves to people like him. He shook her hand hesitantly, feeling out of place. "Nice to meet you," he mumbled, though his voice carried a hint of confusion. Catherine looked around the room briefly before focusing her eyes back on him. "I couldn't help but notice earlier, your son pointed at me." Daniel's face turned red. He lowered his gaze, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry about that. He just misses his mom. He thought you looked like her. Please don't take it the wrong way." To his surprise, Catherine didn't seem offended. In fact, her expression softened. "Children see things differently than we do," she said quietly. "Sometimes they notice things we don't." Daniel nodded, not sure how to respond. He wanted the conversation to end, to avoid any more embarrassment. But Catherine didn't leave. Instead, she pulled a chair closer and sat down across from him. "Tell me about your son," she said. Her request caught Daniel off guard. Why would someone like her, someone who probably dealt with million-dollar decisions every day, want to hear about a little boy from a struggling family? Still, there was something kind in her eyes, something that told him she genuinely wanted to know. So, he told her. He spoke about Oliver's love for drawing, about how he could spend hours with just a pencil and paper, creating little worlds of his own. He talked about how Oliver always asked about his mother, even though she had passed when he was too young to remember her clearly. And he admitted how hard it had been, raising him alone while trying to make ends meet. Catherine listened intently, her face calm but her eyes thoughtful. It almost seemed as though she was searching for something in his words, something deeper than what he was saying. When he finished, there was a brief silence. "You're doing more than most people could," she finally said. "Raising a child alone, especially under these circumstances, takes incredible strength." Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Strength doesn't pay hospital bills," he replied, his voice low. Catherine studied him for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. "What if I told you, you don't need to worry about that tonight?" Daniel looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Your son's care will be covered," she said simply. "You don't have to think about the cost." For a moment, Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. His instinct was to refuse. He didn't like taking handouts. But then he thought about Oliver, about the tests he needed, about the medicine that could help him recover. Pride was something he could swallow. His son's health was not something he could risk. "Why would you do that for us?" he asked, his voice full of suspicion but also gratitude. Catherine hesitated, and for the first time, Daniel noticed a flicker of emotion in her eyes, as if she was holding back something personal. "Let's just say, sometimes we cross paths with people for a reason," she replied. Before Daniel could ask more, the nurse returned with Oliver. The little boy was drowsy from the tests, but as soon as his eyes opened and landed on Catherine, he whispered again, "Mommy." The room grew silent. Daniel's chest tightened, ready to apologize again. But this time, Catherine didn't look away. She stepped closer to Oliver's bed, her hand trembling just slightly. She gazed at the boy with an expression Daniel couldn't quite understand, part sorrow, part recognition. "Rest now, sweetheart," she whispered gently, as though the words had come naturally, almost instinctively. Oliver smiled faintly before drifting back to sleep. Daniel stared at Catherine, confusion swirling in his mind. Why did she react that way? Why didn't she dismiss Oliver's words this time? And why, for the first time since his wife's passing, did Daniel feel like there was a story here he didn't know? As Catherine quietly excused herself and walked out of the room, Daniel sat frozen in thought. Something told him this night was only the beginning of a much bigger story, one that could change his and Oliver's lives forever. Daniel barely slept that night in the hospital. He sat in the chair beside Oliver's bed, holding his little hand, watching every rise and fall of his chest. The machines beeped softly, and the air felt heavy with silence. His mind kept circling back to the strange moment from earlier, the way Oliver had called the hospital CEO mommy, and how Catherine had not brushed it off. Instead, she had looked at Oliver with eyes full of something Daniel couldn't explain. By morning, the tests were completed. The doctors came in with results. Thankfully, the infection was treatable with medicine and rest. Relief washed over Daniel, though it was mixed with new worries about how he would manage after leaving the hospital. He thanked the doctors, his heart grateful at least that Oliver was safe. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about Catherine. Why did she care enough to cover the bills? Why did she stay to listen to his story? And why, for a brief second, did she look at Oliver like she truly knew him? Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped into the hallway to stretch his legs while Oliver slept. The hospital was busy, filled with doctors and nurses moving quickly from one patient to another. Just as he turned a corner, he saw her again. Catherine was walking with two other people, clearly part of a business discussion. She looked focused, her hands carrying a folder full of papers. Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to bother her, but something inside him pushed him forward. He had questions that wouldn't let him rest. Gathering courage, he approached. "Miss Hayes," he called out quietly. She stopped, surprised, and dismissed the people with her. "Mr. Daniel," she said warmly, "how is your son?" "He's better," Daniel replied. "The doctors say he'll be fine in a few days." He paused, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "I wanted to thank you, for helping us. I don't know why you did it, but I'm grateful." Catherine's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't need an explanation." Daniel nodded, though his curiosity only grew. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you know my son? I mean, the way you looked at him last night, it felt like you recognized him." For the first time, Catherine seemed caught off guard. She looked away, her jaw tightening. "That's complicated," she murmured. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Catherine sighed and motioned for him to follow her. She led him to a quieter corner of the hospital, away from the noise of the hallways. There, she leaned against the wall, as if gathering the strength to speak. "Years ago," she began slowly, "before I became the person you see now, my life was very different. I wasn't always a CEO. I was a young woman trying to survive in a world that demanded sacrifices." Daniel listened closely, unsure where this was leading. "I was in love once," Catherine continued, her voice softer. "But I made choices that pulled me away from that life. I buried myself in work, chasing success, convincing myself that was the only way forward. And in doing so, I lost people who mattered." Daniel's heart pounded. Her words felt heavy with meaning, though he didn't yet understand how they connected to him or Oliver. Catherine looked directly at him now, her eyes steady but full of sorrow. "When your son called me mommy, it wasn't just a child's mistake. There's a reason he feels a connection. He has her eyes I once knew very well." Daniel's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I knew your wife," Catherine said gently. "More than that, we were once very close. She was my best friend. We shared everything. But life took us in different directions, and I left that part of my life behind. Seeing your son yesterday was like seeing her again." Daniel stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought of his late wife, Emily, the love of his life, the woman he missed every single day. She had never spoken much about her past, about the people she once knew. And now here stood Catherine, a powerful CEO, claiming to have been part of that hidden chapter. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Catherine's eyes glistened. "Maybe she wanted to protect you. Or maybe she didn't want the past to overshadow the future you were building together. Emily was always like that, putting others before herself." Daniel's throat tightened at the sound of his wife's name. It had been so long since he had heard someone else speak it with such familiarity. For a moment, memories flooded back: the way Emily laughed, the way she sang softly to Oliver when he was a baby, the way she made their small home feel warm no matter how little they had. Catherine stepped closer. "Your son, he's a piece of her that still lives on. That's why I couldn't just walk away. When he called me mommy, I felt something I hadn't felt in years." It wasn't just his words, it was as if Emily herself was reaching out. Daniel swallowed hard, his emotions swirling. "So you're telling me, you were part of her life before me? And now you feel connected to Oliver because he reminds you of her?" "Yes," Catherine whispered. "I can't explain it fully, but it feels like fate brought me back here. Like I was meant to see him, to see you." Silence filled the hallway. Daniel didn't know what to think. Part of him was grateful for the kindness Catherine had shown. Another part of him felt unsettled, as though doors from the past had been forced open, revealing stories he had never been told. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I don't know what this means for us. I only know that my son needs stability, not confusion. He's already lost so much." Catherine nodded slowly. "I understand. I don't want to disrupt your lives. But if you'll allow it, I'd like to be there for Oliver, not as his mother, but as someone who cared deeply for the woman who gave him life. Maybe, in some small way, I can honor her memory." Daniel studied her face. He could see the sincerity in her eyes. And though he was unsure of what the future held, a part of him knew that Oliver's innocent words had uncovered something bigger than either of them had expected. That night, back in the hospital room, Daniel sat beside his son again. He held Oliver's hand and whispered softly, "You're stronger than you know, buddy. And maybe the world is bigger than I thought." As Oliver slept peacefully, Daniel glanced toward the door, half expecting Catherine to walk in again. Something told him this was only the beginning of a connection that would reshape all their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The night was quiet inside the hospital, but Daniel's mind was restless. He sat by Oliver's bed, replaying every word Catherine had spoken. Her confession about knowing Emily, about being close to her before their lives separated, weighed heavily on his heart. He had loved Emily with everything he had, yet it hurt to realize there were parts of her past he had never truly known. When morning light filtered through the blinds, Oliver stirred. His fever had lowered, and his breathing was steadier. Relief filled Daniel's chest, but his thoughts about Catherine lingered. He didn't know whether to let her near his son again or to keep his distance. He didn't want Oliver to grow attached to someone who might disappear from their lives once more. Later that day, Catherine returned. She walked into the room with the same quiet confidence, but this time there was a softness in her eyes. She carried a small bag filled with books and crayons. "I thought Oliver might like these," she said, setting them gently on the bedside table. Oliver's face lit up when he saw the crayons. "Thank you," he said shyly, his small hands reaching for them. He began drawing right away, filling the paper with shapes and colors. Catherine watched him, her lips curving into a smile that looked both joyful and bittersweet. Daniel studied her carefully. He could see something genuine in her gestures, but his doubts hadn't vanished. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. Catherine turned to him, her expression calm. "Because I owe it to Emily. And because, when I look at Oliver, I see her spirit. She gave so much love to those around her, and I lost the chance to appreciate it fully. Maybe this is my chance to give back, even if it's only in small ways." Daniel folded his arms. He doesn't need false hope. He already lost his mother. I can't let him lose someone else. Her eyes softened. "I understand. But I'm not here to replace her. I only want to be a support if you'll let me." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His instincts told him to protect Oliver, to build walls around him so he would never face more heartbreak. But another part of him, the part that remembered Emily's kindness and warmth, wondered if maybe this woman truly carried a piece of her past with her. The following days passed slowly. Oliver continued to recover, and Catherine visited often. Sometimes she brought books, other times small puzzles or snacks. She didn't overwhelm Oliver, instead, she quietly sat with him, talking to him as if she had known him for years. Oliver, in his innocent way, accepted her presence without question. To him, she was not his mother, but someone who made him feel safe. One afternoon, Oliver drew a picture with his crayons. It was a simple sketch of 3 figures holding hands. One was clearly himself, another was Daniel, and the third had long hair and a bright smile. He handed it to Catherine. "This is you," he said. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she took the drawing. She pressed the paper gently against her chest, her voice trembling. "It's beautiful, Oliver. Thank you." Daniel watched the moment silently, his heart torn. He wanted to protect his son from confusion, but he also couldn't deny the bond forming between them. It wasn't forced, it was natural, born from kindness and warmth. That evening, Daniel stepped out of the hospital room and found Catherine in the hallway. She stood near a large window, gazing at the city skyline as the sun began to set. He approached her slowly. "You seem to care about him a lot," he said. She turned, her eyes shining in the fading light. "I do. More than I expected. He reminds me so much of Emily. And maybe of the life I could have had if I had chosen differently." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Catherine sighed. "When Emily and I were young, we dreamed of a future filled with family, love, and simple happiness. But I chose ambition. I chose success, power, and recognition. I told myself it was the right path, but deep down, I knew I was running away from the softer parts of myself. Emily embraced those things. She found love, she became a mother, she lived the kind of life I walked away from." Daniel's chest ached at her words. He thought about how Emily had always seemed content with small joys: a walk in the park, a homemade dinner, a bedtime story with Oliver. She never cared for wealth or status. And now, here was Catherine, a woman who had everything the world admired, admitting she felt the emptiness of her choices. "Why tell me this?" Daniel asked quietly. "Because you deserve the truth," Catherine replied. "And because I don't want you to think my presence in your lives is just out of pity. It's not. It's something I feel deep in my heart, something I can't ignore." Daniel didn't reply right away. He stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. "I promised Emily I'd take care of Oliver. I can't let anyone hurt him. He's all I have." Catherine stepped closer. "Then let me help you keep that promise." Not as his mother, she will always hold that place, but as someone who loved her dearly and now cares for him too. "I know I can't erase the past, but maybe I can make a small difference in your future." Her words lingered in Daniel's mind long after she left. He returned to the room and sat beside Oliver, who had fallen asleep clutching his crayons. Looking at his son, Daniel realized something: perhaps love didn't always come in the ways one expected. Sometimes it arrived in unexpected forms, through people who carried pieces of the past into the present. The next day, Catherine visited again, and this time Daniel didn't question her presence. He allowed her to sit with Oliver, to read him stories, to laugh with him. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel heavy with loneliness. It felt fuller, warmer. As the days stretched on, Daniel began to see Catherine not as an outsider but as someone who belonged not by blood, but by heart. And though the future was still uncertain, he felt a quiet hope growing inside him, a hope he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as he tucked Oliver into bed, Oliver whispered, "Daddy, I like her." Daniel smiled faintly. "I know, buddy. She cares about you. Do you think Mommy would like her too?" Oliver asked innocently. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of Emily, of her boundless kindness, of the way she always welcomed people into her heart. Slowly, he nodded. Yes, Oliver. I think Mommy would like her very much. And as Oliver drifted into sleep, Daniel realized that the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack. Maybe it was time to let a little light back in. The day finally came when the doctors told Daniel that Oliver was strong enough to leave the hospital. The infection had been treated, and his little body was healing well. Relief filled Daniel's heart as he packed the few belongings they had brought with them. But as he zipped up the bag, he realized that these past days had changed more than just his son's health. Life inside those hospital walls had felt strangely different, lighter, warmer because of Catherine. She had shown up not just once but again and again, always bringing something thoughtful, always speaking with gentle kindness, always looking at Oliver with eyes full of care. Daniel couldn't deny it anymore, she had become part of their world, even if only for a short while. On the morning of their discharge, Catherine appeared once more. She wasn't wearing her usual business suit. Instead, she dressed simply, with a soft cardigan over her shoulders. She held a small gift bag in her hands, and when Oliver saw her, he smiled brightly. "You came," he said, his voice full of excitement. "Of course," she replied warmly, kneeling beside him. "I wouldn't miss it." She handed him the bag. Inside was a little toy car and a coloring book. Oliver's eyes sparkled with joy as he hugged her tightly. Daniel stood nearby, watching the scene. A part of him still worried about what this connection might mean for Oliver, but another part of him couldn't help but feel grateful. He cleared his throat softly. "Thank you for everything. You didn't have to do any of this, but you did. I don't know how to repay you." Catherine looked up at him, her expression calm but sincere. "You don't need to repay me. Sometimes life brings people together for reasons we don't understand. All we can do is accept it." They left the hospital together, stepping out into the fresh morning air. Daniel held Oliver's hand while Catherine walked beside them. It felt unusual, almost like they were a family. The thought both comforted and unsettled Daniel. He wasn't sure if he was ready for such feelings, but he also couldn't deny that it felt good to not be alone. As they waited for a taxi, Oliver tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, can she come with us?" he asked innocently, pointing at Catherine. Daniel hesitated. He glanced at Catherine, who gave a small, almost hopeful smile. Finally, he nodded. "If she wants to." Catherine's smile grew. "I'd be honored," she said softly. They rode together back to Daniel's small apartment. It wasn't much, just a modest place with peeling paint and worn furniture, but it was home. As Catherine stepped inside, she looked around quietly, noticing the little details, Oliver's drawings taped to the walls, the books stacked unevenly on a shelf, the well-used shoes by the door. It was clear this home was built on love, even if money was scarce. Oliver proudly showed her his room, where he kept his crayons and sketches. Catherine sat on the floor beside him, listening as he explained each drawing. Daniel watched from the doorway, his heart torn between caution and hope. He had never let anyone into their world like this since Emily passed. Yet here Catherine was, sitting on the floor of their tiny apartment, treating it like the most important place in the world. That evening, as Oliver drifted off to sleep, Daniel and Catherine sat in the living room. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You have everything," he said quietly. "A powerful job, respect, wealth. Why bother with us? We're just ordinary people trying to survive." Catherine turned her gaze toward him. "Because sometimes everything means nothing without someone to share it with. I've spent years building my career, achieving goals that looked impressive from the outside. But inside, I was lonely. Seeing Oliver, seeing you, it reminded me of the part of life I gave up. And maybe this is my second chance to be part of something real." Daniel's chest tightened. He had spent so long carrying the weight alone that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to share the burden. Still, his protective instinct rose. I can't let Oliver get attached if you're not going to stay. He's been through enough. Catherine's eyes softened. I don't plan to walk away. Not if you'll let me stay. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Daniel looked into her eyes and saw not the powerful CEO, but a woman searching for meaning, a woman who had once loved his wife as a friend, and who now wanted to honor her memory by caring for the boy she left behind. In the days that followed, Catherine became a frequent visitor. She joined them for dinners, helped Oliver with homework, and sometimes even read him bedtime stories. At first, Daniel worried it was temporary, that she would eventually return to her busy life and forget about them. But she didn't. She kept showing up, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Slowly, the apartment that once felt heavy with loneliness began to feel alive again. There was laughter at the dinner table, conversations that stretched into the night, and moments of peace Daniel hadn't felt in years. One weekend, Catherine invited them both to the hospital's community event. It was a gathering she hosted every year for families in need. Daniel was hesitant, but Oliver was excited, so they went. For the first time, Daniel saw Catherine not just as a powerful leader but as a woman who gave her heart to others. She greeted every child with warmth, listened to every parent with care, and worked tirelessly to make everyone feel valued. Watching her, Daniel realized something: Catherine wasn't trying to take Emily's place. She was creating her own place in their lives, one built on sincerity and compassion. And maybe that was enough. One night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Daniel and Catherine sat together again. This time, Daniel spoke first. I don't know what the future holds, he admitted. But I do know this: you've already made a difference in our lives. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm carrying this weight alone. And for that, I'm grateful. Catherine's eyes glistened. She reached over and gently touched his hand. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of understanding, of unspoken promises, of hope. From that moment on, their lives began to change. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in small, meaningful ones. Catherine became part of their everyday routine. Daniel found comfort in her presence, and Oliver found joy in her attention. Together, they built something that wasn't perfect, but it was real. And though Emily's absence would always be felt, her spirit lived on in Oliver's smile, in Daniel's determination, and even in Catherine's unexpected return. She had walked back into their lives not as a replacement, but as a reminder that love could take many forms, and family wasn't always defined by blood alone. As weeks turned into months, Daniel finally allowed himself to believe in something he had long forgotten: a brighter future. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he and Oliver were no longer walking it alone.